Yes.
Oh, it's on.
Okay, we're on? Everybody can hear me and all that jazz? Yes, okay.
So then when it comes time to questions and answers,
Right.
why don't you just do this and give it to people?
I
If you
can.
want me to. What do you?
You to just, if that's okay. Okay, so, and once again, first of all, why, they put this so... Yeah, really. I mean, honestly, to tell you the truth, I really liked it better when you guys were all in like a semicircle. Walk around with people, and I got people to act out biblical roles, which I haven't asked you to do yet, but maybe that's something that's next. Okay. So one thing I do want to mention before we get started, because I think this is useful for could try to act that out, but we don't really have a platform. So you're going to have to imagine that I'm Sarah, right? And that if I want to adopt the child that Hagar is having with Avram, the physical thing that I am doing to embody the actual legal transfer of her child to me is that I am resting in some way on a chair, and Hagar is leaning against me as she against my knees, right, on my knees, as she gives birth, symbolizing that the child is coming through my body, not hers. Do you see what's happening here? Like, if she's leaning back enough on me, then, whose womb is producing the child that comes out? You see what I'm saying? And that was actually a physical and a legal way for one woman to adopt the baby of handmaidens or other women, right? And so probably Leah and Rachel did the same with Zilpah and Bilhah, right? So that was what that statue was that I showed you. Remember that? Okay. So ask questions, interrupt me. Also, if you really do need to leave, right? The reason that I was mindfully saying, are there any questions, are there any thoughts, and then really waiting, is because some of you will take a while to decide whether you have the courage to do this. And I want to try to give that silence to you. If you need to leave the room, because there were a couple people in the back who needed to leave, and that was clear to me from body language, just really do. Sit in the back and just creep out. It won't bother me. It's fine. I will not be insulted. Okay? So have we got those sort of ground rules for how we're going to get started? All right. Dina and Yael, otherwise as Dinah and Jael, if you are pronouncing them the way we often see in America those things pronounced. And I want to start by talking to you about a particular way of thinking about Torah, thinking about Bible that is very, very Jewish. You're going to get introduced to a very Jewish concept here. So this particular text, I've given you a standard translation, and then I've put in red and I'm so sorry that it's not as pretty as it is in the back. I've put in red some really key words. The first ones you can see are boundaried by parentheses, right? And then you see in the red down there, you see the parentheses, and then you see two separate kinds of constellations of Hebrew words separated out. So the first one reads eshdat, which is not a word that we know, really. As etymologically, it's a confusing word. But it is really easy to take these letters apart and create these two words, esh and dat. Because those words are very common words. They're very well-known words. They're very understandable words. And those words are fire and discernment or knowledge. Fire and knowledge. Now it's translated up here, you can see, as lightning, because the translators have to do something with it. But this particular verse is actually so confusingly written in some respects that things that have been put up here as place names, like Rebobot Kodesh, that text actually can mean 10,000 holy ones, right? You could translate this as essentially God not approaching from a particular place with lightning flashing at them from his right, but you could translate this as he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones, like holy beings of some sort, and at his right hand, you could go on and say there was flashing lightning, or you could say there was eshdat, there was fire and knowledge, right? Isn't that interesting? It already should make you feel about as confused as you can get about what is the biblical author trying to tell me. I don't know. But what is important about this eshdat is that it becomes an absolutely critical premise to Jewish exegesis. And that has to do with an idea that Jews develop around the very nature of the words of Bible and how those words function. So, how was Torah written? It was written with eshdat, right? It was written with fire. And if you look at any scroll, right, you'll see these letters, these very interesting, intricately, beautifully calligraphied letters of very pitch dark black, right? They're made of a very special kind of ink. There are lots of rules about how you write these letters. Scribes sing the letters as they write them, many. If you write the name of God incorrectly, the entire parchment has to be disposed of, right? There's like all sorts of what can you erase, what can you not, lots of intricate rules here. And the idea, because even the form of these letters seems a little bit like it's fiery, it has flames coming out of the letters. You can actually see on some of the letters like a little flame coming off the top. So this happens enough so that the Jewish tradition is to say you have these letters of black fire written on a surface of white fire. And that is what Torah is. That is what Bible is. That is what our Tanakh is. White fire and black fire written on white. Now, why would that be important? Because it's a metaphor or another way of picturing the thing that we all do all the time, which is to read great works of literature and discover that sometimes we're reading between the lines, right? Because something is so subtly put and so subtly described that between the lines you can see another possible meaning, another possible reading. You know what I'm talking about, right? Poetry. Every time you're doing poetry, you're reading in between the lines all the time because it's so cryptic. So today we're going to do a lot of reading in between the lines and finding out what happens when we do that. So commentary, right? Invention, recreating the text in a new way. We're going to start with something that I want to recall from last week. Remember remember this sad situation, right? Leah, mother of two. Zilpah, mother of two. Bilhah, mother of two. And they're mothers of what? Sons, yes, all boys, right? Frankly, the kind of child that really matters in this culture. Yes, thank you for making that face. It is a problem. Like, what did they think they were going to do without the other side? I don't know. But, you know, this, like many cultures that prize the warrior, and this is in some respects a warrior culture, particularly in the books of Samuel, as we talked about last year, and we could talk about again, having sons is what gives you a woman value, right? So Rachel is the mother of no sons. So I want you now to go backward to last week and remember when we entertained the idea that Joseph was not as clearly male or masculine as it might seem, right? The idea even that Joseph was perhaps in some way that all these little clues, right, about what he wore, about what his father gave him, and by the way, I went straight to Rabbi Erwin Keller with that last week and said, we need to think about that piece. So there you go. Like, he'll never meet you, but you've gone all the way to California. So, you know, this idea that Joseph was maybe female at the core, right, is actually supported by what we call Agadah, which is storytelling about these characters, of which there is a very, very rich Jewish tradition. I'm not sure I've told you this, but when I retired, did I tell you what I was going to write my second novel about? No, Ashmodai. Have you ever heard of Ashmodai? In Jewish tradition and Jewish legends, he is the king of demons. Now, Jewish tradition has a very different attitude towards demons, and he studies Torah, by the way, and he recites Psalms, by the way, and he has conversations with God. Now, if that isn't the subject of a novel, I don't know what is. Anyway, so there you go. So Agadah, storytelling, right? We have an Agadah in Talmudic stories, and we have in Targums, which are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew, which also include a lot of storytelling. A story about Leah being, when she was pregnant, deeply concerned about Rachel's dignity, because Rachel was the mother of no sons, right? So I alluded a little bit to this last week. And what is it that she wants? She was determined that Rachel should bear at least as many sons as the handmaids did, right? The handmaidens, Zilpah and Bilhah. Leah herself has 4, right? And so she prays. They're pregnant at the same time, according to this story. And this is her prayer in these 2 various texts. Shall my sister Rachel not even be as one of the handmaidens? Leah therefore prayed to God on behalf of her sister, entreating him, turn what is in my womb into a female. Do not prevent my sister from bearing a son. God accepted her prayer, and the fetus in her womb was transformed into a girl. And then the proof text. We'll get to the proof text in a minute, because on the face of it, how does that say that God turned a boy into a girl? You're looking at that, and where does it say that? Where do they get that? We'll get to that in just a minute. But the idea, right, that Leah would pray that the male fetus that she was carrying be turned into a girl so that her sister has the possibility of having the sons that she should have for her own dignity, right? You just want to sit with that for a minute. We are constantly portraying and imagining Leah and Rachel as bitter enemies, right? As having a certain kind of thing going on. Can you imagine that? What kind of female solidarity is going on here? Sisterly concern. Okay, so why is it that the rabbis get, this story out of the biblical text? Because never, never, never do they just invent a story without having what we call a proof text. Something they grab from the text and say, see, this proves that my story has merit, right? Has a point. And in this case, we have this text that you've just seen. Last, she bore him a daughter and named her Dinah. The first word in red there, which you can see much better if you turn around, right? You'll see the and then you'll see that little red piece there, achar. The first letter means and. Achar means after. So you're saying, oh, that makes everything very clear, Rabbi Barbara Thiede. Now we understand. Well, you will if you know that achar and acheret, achar is for a male child, and acheret is for a female child. So we have a signal because a male version, right? Like we've got a gendered language here, like Spanish is. You know, if some of you have ever, there are other Romance languages. We've got this signal. Oh, she's got a male child in her womb. Nope, she's got a female child in her womb. You see what I'm saying? A reason I didn't show this to you last week to talk to you about, like, you know, Joseph and all of those kinds of things, because I wanted you to see what happens with Dinah, right? Dinah was Joseph, maybe, in a way, right? And then suddenly, no, she's Dinah because Leah has prayed for this. This is so actually important that Targum Yonatan tells this story in a similar story, but tells it differently in response to this, and actually suggests that what happened was that the sisters' fetuses were miraculously switched, right? So the story then becomes that Leah's child has become Rachel's child, Joseph, and Rachel's child, Dinah, becomes Leah's child, her daughter, her first daughter. Isn't that interesting? Because now you've got such an interesting possible question. You know, you have to ask yourself, the fetus swapping, the baby swapping stories, you know those stories, how they show up in legends all the time, that babies were swapped? It's kind of a folkloric way of telling a story, and you have to wonder, I know this is like maybe a little strange, but you have to wonder if these folklore stories are explaining in part why Joseph's character is so often framed in female kinds of terms, right? People are reading the text and they're trying to explain how things are happening the way they are when they're unusual. Is this kind of fetus swapping idea a way to explain why we've got Joseph bearing Ephraim and Manasseh on his knees? Wait, what? We have Joseph wearing a princess's tunic. Wait, what? We have Jacob blessing Joseph with the blessings of breast and womb. Wait, what? You see what I'm saying? You get enough of those wait whats, and you start trying to put all these pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle, and then seeing if you can come up with another explanation. Now, what is important about this? What is important? Some years back, I had a student who walked into my, in that case, the God and Sex course. And as I had made a practice of in those, starting in those years, I said, if your name is different than the name I've got, because in those days, the university would not permit the students to name themselves. If your pronouns are different than you think I might expect, then please let me know before class begins, or in class, just tell me what your name and your pronouns are, and then I'll call you by those things the rest of the semester. And I had a student whose name was officially Alex, and who asked to be called Allie. And over the next 4 years, that student made very difficult choices and transitioned and became Allie in a way that others could see Allie. And for 4 years, Allie and I knew each other because Allie took more than one class with me, and because Allie would come to my office. And there was a time during those 4 years when Allie told me, I never go to the bathroom anywhere on campus. I have to basically hold everything for the entire day, because there was a law around the bathrooms. Now, whatever your feelings are about this topic that I've brought to you, I want to make a plea for us to consider that when we are asking any human being, a human being, to not be able to fulfill functions, right, for what was for Allie, because Allie did not live on campus, an 8-hour school day. We are tormenting another person's body, right? That's not morally good. That's not ethical. We have no business hurting people, whatever we feel about these issues. And so, for me, the fact that there can be anywhere in Torah an invitation to think about gender as something which is not so easily boxed in is a gift for people like Allie, who otherwise might have felt there's no space in these texts for me to recognize myself. And so again, regardless of how you stand on any of these positions, it is not and cannot be, I would say, our decision to close things off to every human being because of the way we feel about something, right? It might be closed off to us in certain ways, and we can make that decision. That's all right. But the reason for this text being so important to me, for this midrash being so important to me, is that I want to feel that Torah is not closed off to anyone, that biblical literature is not shut from anyone, that everyone has some way to access this, because even with all of its incredible dangers, which I have spoken to you about, there is something for me that is sacred and holy about these texts and about what they can do and about how they can heal and about how they can tell you to love. What is the mandate that they tell you over and over 36 times? Love the stranger, right? Take care of the orphan and the widow, right? Those things are absolutely beyond precious. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? If we don't hold to that kind of thing, we've given up something precious that belongs to us. So that's the piece about Dina. Any questions before I move on to Yael, who is a really interesting character? Yes.
Would that not show that the power of God, if that story is to change wombs and so forth, or the power of prayer?
Or the power of prayer, yeah. Yeah, the question was, does it not demonstrate, thank you, Pat. Thank you, Pat. The power of God to effect effectively a miracle, or the power of prayer to effect a change and a miracle? Yeah, absolutely. Now this story, right, the one about that I showed you that Leah is praying is not in Bible itself. It's extrapolated from this one word for the rabbis who were trying to figure out in part why Dina is Dina and Joseph is Joseph, right? So they're extrapolating, they're creating a story in much the same ways, by the way, that Christian tradition also extrapolates very interesting things sometimes, which make my head turn. Like the stick that, Moses uses to hit the rock to give water to the Israelites in the desert is actually Jesus. That is a Christian reading of that story, right? So we all do it. Your folks do it, my folks do it. We create, and there is really, even as much as I go, wait, what? The stick is Jesus? And what? Right? Like sometimes I'll look at that and it'll seem really strange to me. But all of these additional stories are a way for us to access the text. And whatever tradition you come from, if you get beauty out of it, yeah, beauty out of it, like who's going to complain about that, right? So yeah. Okay, any other questions? And I'll promise to repeat the question if it comes up again. Or thoughts? Go, go, go.
If Joseph then exhibited female,
Characteristics, yeah.
did Dinah?
Oh, gosh. We know so little about Dinah other than she goes, there is one thing that she does that seems unusual for a girl at that time, but we only have like 4 verses that have to do with Dinah. It's that small. She goes out walking to meet other girls of the neighborhood. And for a biblical text, for a young girl to go out walking on her own, no, you don't do that. Boys, yes, Joseph can walk out in the fields alone, but girls cannot. And she meets up with the prince of Shechem, and you all remember what happens after that. He effectively rapes her. And then he negotiates to marry her. It's a very fraught problem. But the fact that she walks out on her own initiative, unaccompanied, as a female, is already a more male kind of behavior. Yes, yeah. And while I didn't bring this up, another interesting character who does things that seem rather male is Rebecca, because the whole story of her, grabbing water and feeding the camels, and, literally the physical thing that she has to do there to feed these 10 camels is like, 25 gallons of water for each one. She does a Herculean task, and she's consistently, I can see someone nodding their head behind there, maybe you know where I'm going, she's consistently referred to as a na'ar, not a na'ara. A na'ar is a young boy. A na'ara is a young girl. And she's consistently through the text referred to as a young boy. Isn't that interesting, right? So, yeah, that happens more than you would think. Okay, so in the Bible, right, who is Yael? Who is she? So she is presented in various ways. One, firstly, as a woman. The deity is going to sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. That's what the announcement that Devorah makes. She is also presented as a wife. Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Hever the Kenite. This is, by the way, something that comes up a lot in the chapter I wrote about Yael and Devorah in Malignant Fraternities. So that particular point here I make that we have to think about the name of Hever, which means friend. Sisera is literally running away towards a friend, to a friend, and where does he end up? He ends up in her tent, and we know what happens, right? So there's this little irony going on here, that his friend is not there to give him the homosocial male protection he needs, running away from battle to help him survive, and instead he meets up with this woman, his friend's wife. And then we know she's an outsider. How many outsider women do we know who helped Project Israel? You can name them, right? Tamar of Genesis 38. She is not an Israelite, but she insists Judah has to perform the levirate, right? She's like following Israelite law to make sure that Judah ends up with a male son. Remember that? And she produces the 2 twins, and eventually the line of David comes from that. So Tamar, Canaanite, not an Israelite woman. Rahab, remember her? Prostitute, madam, who helps the Israelites conquer Jericho, right? We've got a plethora, Hagar, right? A plethora of foreign women in this story who end up in some way or another supporting the Israelite project. We have absolutely no idea why Yael does. She never has any conversation with Devorah. Devorah predicts what she's going to do, but we don't even know if Devorah is predicting particularly what Yael is going to do, or just a woman. She prophesies a woman is where Sisera is going to land. So here are these 3 things we know about her. She's a woman. She is married. She's an outsider. So far, seems like kind of a fairly clear portrayal of femininity of some kind. And what does she do in terms of her actions? Now, again, in my own work, I emphasize a lot the extent to which she is doing a lot of motherly behaviors here, right? Literally, he asks for water. What does she give him? Milk. Does that sound like a mother feeding a baby? She covers him up more than once, twice with a blanket, right? She lays him down. She's tucking him into this womb-like setting, this tent right? All of this stuff is, he falls exhausted to the ground, and she's caring for him in this very motherly way. Again, is this not falling lockstep in what we imagine in terms of gender would be self-evident? Yael's a woman, she's a mother, she's a wife, she can act motherly because she knows all those roles. She knows all those roles. So it seems straightforward, doesn't it? And now you're saying, yeah, okay, now she's gonna, because that's the trick Rabbi Barber does every time. We know that one. All right, so first of all, Sisera himself does something very, very interesting in the Hebrew. He says to her, stand at the entrance, right, while I'm sleeping and, recovering from running away from the battlefield, which already, yes, why did you do that with your eyebrows? He ran away from the battlefield. What does that say about him? Pardon me? Yes, absolutely. Other things that says about Sisera? That he runs away from battle? He's a coward. Yeah, no. I mean, you don't run away from battle without, really signaling something. And so there we go. Ask if anybody is here, say no. Well, that on the face of it, the English looks pretty straightforward. And the English always looks much more straightforward than the Hebrew might be. So what he says there is he says to her, listen, what I want you to say, if anyone says, and literally those letters in much brighter red back there, hayesh po, right? And if anyone, if somebody comes there and says, man there, right? You should say no. Literally, if anyone asks, is there a man here? You should say, nope, no man. There is no man. So he is kind of admitting that he's not a man. That's how the Hebrew reads. If anyone says, is a man here, you are to say no. So it has this double meaning here. He's almost infantilizing himself. And what happens after this? Anybody remember what happens? Yes, okay, like this, right? Do we know where that tent peg went in? Where do you think that tent peg went in? That she picks up a tent peg and a hammer in his head? Okay, could be forehead. Could also be his mouth. So you want to think about the tent peg through his mouth, right? That is also a possibility, or through his head. But no matter how you shake it, she has picked up a hammer, she's taken a sharp and frankly phallic object, and she has driven it into Sisera's body. This is part of the reason that some commentators for a long time have described this for decades as a potential reverse rape, right? That there's a kind of violence of the phallic instrument being driven into the body of someone who is lying there helpless. Think about how this is reversed. She's alone in the tent. When a man comes towards her, a big soldier, a general, our usual expectation is who's going to get raped? It's going to be the woman, right? She's alone. She's defenseless. There's nobody there to protect her. But what actually happens? She kills him. And there's also a lot of very interesting, there's one version in the prose story, there's one version in the poetic story. Judges 4 and 5 tell the same story. In the poetic version, the description of how she kills him is incredibly, frankly, either very sexualized. She drives this, he falls between her legs, he falls and falls between her legs, or you could see this as a kind of birth metaphor, right, depending on how you want to read that, but it's pretty weird language in the poem, right? So Sisera ends up getting feminized here, and Yael is getting masculine. This is not the behavior of a mother, right? This is not the behavior of you would presume, a loving wife or a nice woman or something like that. And he is despoiled by a woman. This is the most shameful possible ending for a man. It's so shameful that Avimelech says in the book of Judges, when, there's a woman who throws a millstone, a female, household object pretty heavy thing, by the way, on his head, right? And, you know, there's a whole thing about don't let anybody know I died at the hands of a woman. Remember that? And what's more, I know, for some of you, you're going to just say, like, where did she come up with this? But the millstone and the stone on the top are understood in the ancient world also as having sexual associations, right? The rubbing of the top on the bottom, which has this concave thing, comes up in Job, where Job graphically describes a sexual act using the millstone metaphor, right? So she's using this very sexualized, again, kind of image or idea to feminize, despoil, and kill a man. So we have these two scenes have been compared for a reason. And it's very, in the Hebrew, very active. This happens rarely for female characters, where they become the subject of a series of active verbs. She did A, she did B, she did C, she did D. She picks up a hammer, she picks up the tent peg, she drives it into his head, right? Like this series of very active, very frightening words, really. So, this is one reason why Yael has been compared to this lady right here. Now, I'm not sure you would know who this is, but she seems a little frightening, doesn't she? And yes, indeed, she is a little frightening. That's the goddess Anat, who covets male weaponry, right? In the poetry about her, she wants, you know, the weaponry that is given to a male god. She dresses as a man, but then she does something very curious. She puts on her armor, then she disguises with outer clothing the fact that she has the armor on, and she puts on a lot of makeup. Yeah, wild, right? The result of the way that she dresses is that she's a woman dressed as a man, dressed as a woman. Now, if any of you have seen Victor Victoria, you know what I'm talking about, where Julie Andrews does this most amazing woman dressed as a man, dressed as a woman kind of role. So we've got this with Anat. And when she goes on a rampage, the goddess Anat is so fearsome that she is described, you know, she fights a bunch of human males, as being up to her knees as she wades in the blood of the soldiers she has killed. It is a sensation that she enjoys actually so much that when she comes home, she transforms the chairs and the tables into an army of living victims who are fresh for her to trample, right? Like, yeah, you don't want to meet up with Anat, really, often. Scary woman. And at the same time, at the very same time, this character, this warlike character, is also described in highly feminine imagery. So there's a point at which a new baby is birthed by the gods who is supposed to drink the milk and drain the breasts of Anat. Are you confused? It's confusing, right? It is a confusing situation. So, you know, and in addition, she has horns, by the way. She isn't pictured here, but in literature, she has horns. So the warrior queen here is a liminal character who takes on these male attributes while at the same time displaying female attributes. And we have several warrior queens of this ancient Near Eastern period. So I'll come back a little bit to this after we go back to Yael. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit. Yael also has some interesting things about her. Her name either means a mountain goat, which is a fairly masculine kind of image, or it literally means in Hebrew, he went up. So these are very masculine kinds of attributes for a woman who acts in this motherly way and also acts like a warrior who's going to destroy the Israelites' greatest enemy, who is Sisera, right? Now, another piece about Yael is that when Sisera says the say no man is there, another word in Hebrew, amod. This is an imperative masculine form. Sisera talks to Yael as if she's a man. Stand there. He uses the masculine imperative form, not the feminine. She's clearly a woman, but he talks to her as if she were a man. So again, we have these weird things that are happening, and you've got to at least know that this clue exists. Gender indeterminacy. So I may have mentioned Hedwana, the high priestess, that we have so many psalm texts from. In fact, some of these psalm texts read a lot like David's, the psalms attributed to David. Very interesting how you can sometimes say, oh, wow, the language is very, very similar. But they're very, very old. She was the high priestess during the reign of her father, Sargon of Akkad. And look at how she prays to her particular goddess, Inanna, who, by the way, is a storm goddess and a warrior goddess, as well as a fertility goddess. So all these things, again, getting combined in Inanna. To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man are yours, Inanna. Right? So the idea that the gods can turn and change the physical attributes, the gender of human beings, is not unknown in this world. And we have really interesting cases and representations of exactly things like this. So this is a statue of Ur-Nanshe, 2400 BCE. This is a well-known male name for the period. And the statue's body, appears, we seem to have breasts and a very curvy backside, right? Can you see all of how this is shaking out? But the clothing is male for the time. And this particular fellow, Ur-Nanshe, was a singer, right? And so we have this singer who is seemingly shaped like a woman, dressed like a man. And in our ancient texts, I don't have time to show you all of these pictures, but in the 11th century BCE, we have a picture of a male, oh, wait a minute, this one I think I actually did put up for you, a male and a female, and an indeterminate figure that's holding a vessel. Now, you might say that indeterminate figure holding a vessel is clearly a man, but he is also clearly wearing articles of women's clothing. The pleated clothing up to the neck is a woman's dress, and there's a toggle pin at the top that is also women's kind of jewelry that helps to hold the cloth together. There's a male character on the right. He's clearly male because of the male clothing. The pleats are not up to the top here. And on the left, we appear to have a woman holding a baby. But you can see, right, like the one in the middle is somehow doing things that are, and dressing in ways that are indeterminate. We've also unearthed male skeletons that have had these female dress pins, right, from the cloth that's degenerated. We don't know if men who were cross-dressing were constituting some kind of third gender with cultic functions in the ancient world. It's possible that there was a third gender of cultic functionaries, male skeletons, female clothing. We're not sure, scholars don't know. In the 9th century BCE, we have a depiction of one queen where she has a beard, and in the other she doesn't have a beard. The same queen is described, but she has weapons and armor on. But she's otherwise female, right? Has breasts, like clear breasts. So, we've got this setting where in the ancient world we're presented with examples of human beings who are not falling into one category or the other category in a way that makes simple binary sense, right? And we also have figures in Bible that are similarly not falling into one category or the other category. Yael is one of those. So she becomes, and you can see that the picture I've chosen was deliberately ambiguous, right? Is that a man? Is that a woman? Right? Do you know? Can you be sure? Can you be sure you know? You cannot, right? You don't know for certain here. You might feel it leans one way or the other, but you wouldn't be able to know for certain. And the reason this is important is that Yael is not unified. Like Joseph, there is not a unified binary description. We've got male grammar used to describe and to treat Yael in the same way that we have female attributes that come up again and again with Joseph. Yael is an ethnic outsider. She's breaking boundaries. There are things about this story that won't fall into an easy binary space for us, in the same way that Joseph will not fall into an easy binary space for us. And so this is why I'm saying she's a destabilizing figure. Her performance of gender, the way that Yael comes out through these texts, is unsettling, right? If you read the Hebrew, you think, oh, female, wait. Male, wait, right? You're constantly toggling between these kinds of ideas. So why is that important? Again, I think this is, for me, why it's important. Reading the white fire and the black fire, reading what's in the letters and what's behind the letters, right, is by its own, it's a destabilizing thing to do about anything, about hegemonic masculinity, about gender, about relations of power, about characters, anything. And it destabilizes our assumptions about gender, which have been so profoundly influenced, particularly by a Greek and Roman world, right? And once we do that, I personally think, yeah, it should. Destabilizing your assumptions is always worth doing because it keeps you thinking, if nothing else. And I say that about any field. Destabilizing your assumptions is always good for you. Because you know what? When we stop doing that, we stop learning and we stop growing. Even if we get destabilized and we come back to where we were, right? That at least means we've thought it through one more time. Okay, your turn. Questions, thoughts, comments, feelings of shock. Okay. Wait for the microphone. Wait for the microphone and put it right next to your mouth.
Okay. If I
Swallow
was
it.
Hasidic or ultra-conservative, how would I view what you've just presented?
Yeah. If you were I mean, this is a similar problem. Can I be really frank with you all at this point? I think so. This is a similar problem to the problem that if I come and talk to you about the Hebrew of certain texts that you have been taught say this or that about, for example, Jesus or the devil. And if I say to you, sorry, that's not what the Hebrew says, right? That's going to upset some of you, or maybe all of you, because you've been taught that it says a certain kind of thing. I think it is the same problem that any time, no matter where we are politically, it doesn't matter where we are politically or even spiritually, when we are presented with something that seems to shake the very foundations of what we are taught, that is scary. It is frightening. It is upsetting, unnerving, and the first reaction is resistance, right? Pushback and resistance, right? I've had enough years teaching to know how quickly that is the default response. And I am not going to say to you that it did not take me years to look at Christian interpretations of what I understood to be, frankly, these are my texts. What the heck are they doing with them? Right? And sometimes to feel not only defensive but angry. You've twisted the texts. You have altered the texts. You aren't reading the Hebrew. You don't know what it really says. I could have done that stuff. And I think there was a part of me that for a while did, right? And it took me years to leave my own resistance and defensiveness aside and understand that you have a reading and I have a reading, and multiple readings occur along the spectrum of readings of these texts. And if beauty comes out of how you are reading, then I'm good with it. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's where, as a nation, we need to get to this. It doesn't matter what our politics are. If we could be beautiful about what we're saying, rather than angry and enraged and defensive and shouting, why are you wearing that mask? Take that mask off, right? Which apparently happens to this poor woman. What? Why? Right? Why? Why? It's so unnecessary. Yes, okay, we've got one question here and one question back there, so we'll go back there and we'll come back to you, Ginger, in just a minute.
I'm not sure if I need this or not, but when I was teaching at a college, and
What did you teach, sir?
Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois,
And what did you teach?
education.
Okay,
So I had future teachers,
Okay.
and the first day I had a student come into my class, a male student with a dress on. And it took me back a bit, but then I got to know the student. And I got to know the person. And what strikes me, I was trying to put this all together, and I was thinking about togas. Because togas, they're sort of unisex, I guess. And so it's interesting, isn't it, that we think about all this in terms of our dress and how we appear.
We do.
Particularly we go to the whole cross-dressing issue and the whole thing that is going on in Florida. It just strikes me that this is sort of a universal thing, and yet, isn't it more simple if we look at it from our particular Christian viewpoint, where we're supposed to be, which is to love all people and to put aside how they dress, how they look. It's a very difficult concept, I guess, to grasp. And yet we look at this and we say, so I don't know if I'm really making any sense or not, but it struck me, particularly the toga thing, because we've got this situation where everybody looked kind of the same, right? And then we even look at maybe even what allegedly Jesus wore, or people of that era. So I just...
What you're saying is more salient than you might even know. Emmanuel Levinas, who survived the Holocaust, most of his family did not, was shot down, actually. He did not end up in a killing camp or a concentration camp, but he ended up as a POW, as a Jewish, French Jew. And he wrote an amazing amount of philosophy, became an extraordinary, influential 20th century philosopher. And one of the things that he learned in the POW camp was, he spoke a lot about the uniform of the Nazis who, were in front of him. And how could he see, how is there one way to see past the uniform to the person, right? Even in those conditions. And he describes a dog that is in the camp, and the dog doesn't really know the difference between this man and him, right? They're both human beings who will pet the dog. Yes, your description of how is it that we as Jews, as we as Christians, we as secular, agnostic, atheist, whatever we are, human beings, how is it that we can look at each other and say, who is that person within? And where do I find the beauty in that person within? My next door neighbor has political views that are extreme opposite to mine. Extreme opposite, right? I grew up in a family where my father wouldn't even let us have toy guns in the house. Nothing. Not even water squirters, right? We were not allowed to have that. My next door neighbor has a house full of guns. My next door neighbor and I chat on a regular basis about a range of things, including listening to birds and whether he has anything for my compost piles. Okay, we had a question here from Ginger, or a comment. And again, if you need to leave, feel free.
What I'm struggling with is, years ago, I felt I lived in a society where things were pretty calm and people accepted things. And I just struggle with the amount of downright hatred that is intensifying.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where that fits into this story, but I guess I struggle with why, as a society, are we so out of sync?
Well, one of the reasons for that is that people in the political realm and in the social media realm have discovered that anger pays. And I mean anger really pays. Like, you know, on your Facebook accounts, on your various social media accounts, if people can get you upset, and then having to transfer this story or this kind of ad, oh yes, that works. And politicians, same way, right? I get a newsletter from a new representative to Congress who's been describing how the same politicians who are screaming enraged, crazy-making, headline-making things that make us all go, how could she have said such a thing, will, if the doors are closed and there are no cameras there, will suddenly become a rational conversation partner. Yes, you've got something you want to add to that?
Just speaking as a therapist, anger almost always masks fear.
Yes. Yes, it does.
Anger is an empowering emotion. Fear is not. And most angry people, if you scratch them, they're very, very frightened.
They're terrified. And there are reasons, actually, for a lot of people in this country to be terrified. So, you know. And I think acknowledging that fear, like my son, who is a scientist, right, talked to me about why it was that we had so many people so terrified about the COVID vaccines, right? And how, you know, people in his world immediately condemned those people for being unpatriotic and stupid and all this stuff. And he said, you know, honestly, those people who were fearful about that had some right to be really, really also angry that this had even happened, that we hadn't prepared for it, that we hadn't figured out that pandemics could occur, that we didn't understand what was going to be needed. You know, there was a lot of slowness in the way that we responded to this, and the way that he then depicted the fears and the anxieties of, let's face it, a lot of America, right, with understanding and care and even tenderness, as the scientist he is, was, like, for me, important. We need that. We need that. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Okay, next
I
week.
just looked at my wife.
Deborah and Yael and the performance of what happens when women actually in Bible take on in this amazing, it's Deborah and Jezebel, self-aware, take on masculine attributes and stay women. Okay? I'll see you next week.